The morning had started like so many others. I packed a small basket with fresh conchas I'd baked before sunrise, still warm and wrapped in a kitchen towel. Lily loved them more than any sweet in the bakery, and I had promised to stop by after school to surprise her. The short drive across San Antonio was familiar, framed by streets lined with oak trees and houses I could have traced with my eyes closed. It was supposed to be a gentle errand, a grandmother's simple joy. When I turned onto Ava and Daniel's street, I slowed instinctively. Daniel's SUV was in the driveway, which was unusual for a Thursday morning when he should have been at the bank. But it wasn't his car that made my heart stumble. Parked right beside it, as if it belonged there, was Richard's old blue pickup. For a moment I thought I had misread the truck's shape, that maybe another neighbor owned the same model. But I knew that pickup as well as I knew the lines of Richard's face. It was the vehicle that had carried us through lean years, that he polished on Sunday mornings like a ritual. He had told me that morning he'd be at the shop all day fixing a client's transmission. Yet here it sat still, dusted with grease from the garage, nestled like it belonged in Ava's driveway. I pulled forward slowly and parked 2 houses down the basket of conchas, suddenly heavy in my lap. My pulse thrummed in my ears as I stared at the house. The curtains in the living room were mostly drawn, but a thin gap cut across them like an invitation. I told myself not to look, that it was none of my business, that I was imagining shadows where none existed. But curiosity has a way of tugging at a teacher's mind, the same way I used to spot a student hiding answers under a sleeve. I stepped out, smoothed my blouse, and walked quietly to the sidewalk in front of the house. Through the slit of fabric, the scene unfolded with devastating clarity. Richard was there, not hunched with the fatigue of long hours at the garage, but reclined on the sofa with his legs crossed, as comfortable as if he belonged. Beside him, Ava sat at the coffee table, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, stacks of documents spread in front of her. My eyes scanned the pages until the words leapt out: forms, stamped with bold letters, legal petitions, divorce papers. I pressed my hand against the iron gate for balance. The sound of Ava's voice cut through the stillness. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" she asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Richard's reply came smooth, practiced, almost amused. "She doesn't suspect a thing." The air left my lungs in a single rush, as if I had been struck in the chest. 35 years of marriage folded into that sentence, spoken in the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. I stood frozen at the gate, my body heavy and hollow at once, and knew in that moment that the life I thought I knew was already beginning to unravel. I don't remember how long I stood outside Ava's house, gripping the gate. My fingers left faint rust-colored marks where the iron had chipped, but I couldn't feel them. When my knees finally threatened to give, I forced myself back toward the car, the basket of conchas untouched on the passenger seat. I sat there with the engine off, trembling, staring at the steering wheel as if it could steady me. Then, without thinking, I pulled out my phone. I pressed the record button and spoke, my voice shaking, but deliberate, the date, the time, the address, and exactly what I had seen and heard. Richard's truck parked beside Daniel's car. Ava with divorce papers. Richard saying, "I don't suspect a thing." I paused, swallowed, and repeated it all again. Years of teaching came rushing back, the instinct drilled into me that no claim holds weight without evidence. I had told my students 100 times, write it down before you forget. Document before you argue. Now those words became my lifeline. If I was to survive whatever this was, I needed proof, not hysteria. I replayed the recording once, hearing the ragged edge of my own breathing. It steadied me, not because it dulled the pain, but because it gave me a rope to cling to. Proof turned despair into direction. Driving home felt like navigating a dream. The jacaranda trees I had admired that morning blurred past their purple blossoms, littering the street like confetti from someone else's celebration. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a long moment staring at the house that had been my pride. It was a craftsman's solid oak beams and wide porches left to me by my mother. I had moved into it before I married Richard, and it had carried every stage of my life, the newlywed dinners, Daniel's first steps, Lily's birthday balloons taped to the banister. That house wasn't just walls. It was the spine of my history. And suddenly, with brutal clarity, I realized it might be the very prize they were circling. Ava's paralegal mind would know how to twist community property into a weapon. Richard, with his easy lies, would call 35 years of my sweat and care hours, even though the deed bore only my name. I pressed my palm against the porch railing as I climbed the steps, as if the wood itself needed reassurance. Inside the kitchen, clock ticked too loudly. I laid the basket on the counter and unwrapped the conchas, though I had no appetite. I sat at the table, phone in front of me, staring at the blinking red file that held my shaken voice. My marriage was not what I thought it was. My family was not what I believed it to be. But I still had my instincts sharpened by decades of catching students cheating with slips of paper or whispered codes. Richard and Ava thought I didn't suspect. They were wrong. I opened my notebook, drew a clean line across the page, and wrote the first word of a new lesson: evidence. The next morning, I woke with a plan. I told myself it wasn't spying. It was confirming. A teacher doesn't accuse a student of cheating on a hunch. She waits, watches, and collects the slip of paper hidden under the desk. I had spent my career reading the smallest signals, the twitch of an eye, the hesitation before an answer. Now I would turn that skill toward my own family. I drove back to Ava's neighborhood, parking under the shade of a sycamore 2 houses down. The basket of conchas was gone, but I carried a thermos of coffee and my patience. For an hour, nothing happened. Children tumbled off a school bus, a dog barked at the mailman. My pulse eased. Maybe yesterday had been some terrible misunderstanding, papers, misread words, misheard. I almost convinced myself of it until the front door opened. Richard stepped out first, wearing the same navy work shirt, embroidered with his name in red thread. He wasn't hurrying to the shop. He lingered on the porch. Relaxed shoulders, loose a grin that didn't belong to a man late for labor. Ava followed, holding a folder tucked under her arm. She reached up with her free hand and straightened his collar, fingers brushing his neck with the intimacy of a woman adjusting more than fabric. He laughed low and easy, and she laughed back. It was a sound I had never heard her use with Daniel, light, practiced, almost rehearsed for him alone. I gripped my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. From this distance, I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Their bodies spoke the language clearly enough. Richard finally walked to his truck, climbing in with the comfort of routine. Ava stood at the porch rail watching him leave, her smile stretching long after the engine started. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was a text from Richard. Running late at the shop. Don't wait lunch on me. The message was timed to the minute he slid into his truck outside Ava's house. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, then at the driveway, then back again, as if one image might erase the other. But there was no erasing. It was a lie typed out in plain letters, delivered to the wife he assumed was still blind. I saved the message, forwarding it to my own email account for safekeeping. Then I took a photo of the truck, pulling away the license plate glinting in the sun like a mocking wink. I didn't cry. Not then. Anger crowded out the tears, thick and hot, but I kept my face still. If I had learned anything in the classroom, it was the value of patience. A teacher doesn't slam down the confiscated cheat sheet too early. She waits until the student thinks he's safe, then reveals it with quiet certainty. That's when the truth lands hardest. As Richard turned the corner, I twisted the thermos cap shut and started the car. The taste of betrayal lingered bitter in my mouth, stronger than the coffee. This wasn't just a single lapse. This was choreography, repeated enough to look natural. I drove home through streets that looked the same, but now felt altered. The oak branches reached across the asphalt like arms trying to hold me still, to force me to face what I'd witnessed. Yet my mind was already racing ahead, tallying the lies, counting the signals I had ignored for months. His cologne suddenly more expensive, his shirts freshly pressed, though he worked with grease the way he sometimes came home later than the dinner hour, claiming customers held him up. I had believed every excuse. I had smiled and served his plate while he spun stories polished enough for a trusting ear. Back in my kitchen, I laid the phone on the table and looked at it as though it were a witness ready to testify. The text, the photo, my own memory, all evidence. The pieces were small, but together they told a story that could no longer be ignored. And I knew I needed more. The next Saturday, I drove to Nora's house with a manila folder pressed to my chest as if it contained a newborn. My sister opened the door, glasses perched on her nose, her gray hair tied back in its usual no-nonsense bun. She didn't ask questions at first. She just pulled me inside and set a pot of coffee on. When I finally laid the folder on her dining table, my hands shook. Bank statements, old receipts, checkbook stubs I had dug from drawers. Fragments of a life I had never thought to scrutinize. Nora sat down, adjusted her glasses, and began leafing through them with the same calm she used to balance columns when she worked as a CPA. At first, the numbers looked ordinary to me. Grocery charges, utility bills, gas. But Nora's pen tapped against one line, then another. "Do you see this?" she asked. I leaned closer. Small withdrawals, nothing dramatic, $180 here, $240 there. Sometimes on the same day I had handed Richard cash for shop expenses. "Those are his weekend beers with clients," I muttered, repeating the excuse Richard had given more than once. Nora didn't even look up. Not if they're this consistent. Look every 3 or 4 days, always in the afternoon, always in increments, under 300. Someone doesn't want to trigger a flag. She circled them one by one until the page was spotted with blue ink. Then she flipped to the next statement and did the same. By the time she was done, the pattern spread across 3 months like a rash. She added the totals on her calculator, the digital beeps cold and final. 9,875. I felt the air leave my chest. Nearly $10,000 bled out of our account so carefully I'd never noticed. Nora shuffled another page across the table. And here she said, "Transfers." The name printed in block letters made my blood run cold. Ava Martin. Not Ava Hale, her maiden name, the one she used at work. The account numbers varied, but the destination was clear. The room seemed to tilt. My husband wasn't just sneaking off for afternoons of laughter with my daughter-in-law. Together they were draining the life I had built, peso by peso, dollar by dollar. I pressed a hand against my temple, remembering every tutoring hour I'd picked up after retirement to pad our savings. Every Saturday morning, I had spent drilling teenagers on essays, while Richard claimed he was working overtime at the shop. I thought I was saving for a trip to see Nora's grandchildren in Phoenix. Now I saw those hours piled into Ava's account like bricks for the life they were planning without me. "Can you prove it's them?" I asked, voice rough. Nora slid the page back toward me. "These records are proof enough. And if the bank subpoenas the receiving account, it'll tie back to her ID. They've been careless. Careless." The word almost made me laugh. They thought I was the predictable one. They thought age dulled attention, that I folded laundry instead of checking statements. But I was a teacher. I had spent 4 decades catching cheaters with less evidence than this. Nora reached across the table and gripped my hand. "Izzy, listen to me. This isn't just betrayal of the heart. It's theft. Don't let them make you doubt that. Her voice steadied me. I gathered the papers back into the folder, aligning the edges neatly, my old classroom habit. A lesson plan of a different kind was forming. First evidence, then action. When I left Nora's house, the folder rode beside me like a silent companion. Every stoplight I hit, I glanced at it, half afraid it might vanish if I looked away. But it stayed solid and damning. That night at my kitchen table, I laid the papers out again. I ran my fingers over Ava's name over the numbers that proved what my heart had already begun to accept. My marriage wasn't only cracked. It was being dismantled piece by piece. And then the next morning, Lily handed me a drawing that told me betrayal wasn't confined to bank accounts. It had seeped into my granddaughter's world, too. Sunday afternoon, Daniel asked if I could watch Lily while he ran errands. I agreed, grateful for the distraction. I arrived with a basket of tamales and found her sprawled on the living room rug, crayons scattered like confetti around her. "Grandma," she squealed, bounding into my arms. Her hugs always came with such wholehearted force, it almost knocked the air out of me. For a moment, the heaviness in my chest eased. We ate tamales together at the kitchen table, her little feet swinging under the chair. Afterward, she scampered back to her crayons, intent on finishing a drawing. I sipped coffee, watching her tongue poke out in concentration as she pressed colors onto the paper. "Do you want to see Grandma?" she asked, running back with the page clutched in both hands. I smiled, expecting a rainbow, maybe a picture of her dog, but my breath caught the instant I saw it. 4 stick figures: Daniel with his square glasses, Ava with her yellow hair, Lily herself in pink, and in the corner, drawn smaller, hunched with blue streaks dripping from the face, was me, Grandma, crying alone. My throat tightened. "Lily, sweetheart, why am I crying in your picture?" She looked at me, puzzled, as if the answer were obvious. "Because you're always sad, Grandma. Mommy says you get confused. That's why you won't live with us when we move." I set the paper down slowly, afraid my shaking hands would betray me. "Move? Where are you moving?" Lily shrugged. "Mommy said maybe to a new house, a bigger one. With Grandpa." She returned to her crayons, oblivious to the grenade she had just dropped. The room spun. I clutched the table edge, willing myself to breathe. So it wasn't only bank accounts and whispered conversations. Ava was planting seeds in my granddaughter's mind, reshaping the story so that I was the sad, confused relic who didn't belong. Already, Lily accepted it as truth, drawing it in bright crayon colors. I crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Sweetheart, do you think Grandma doesn't belong?" Lily frowned, eyes big and uncertain. "I don't know. Mommy says grown-ups fight, but I love you, Grandma." She flung her arms around my neck, smudging my blouse with crayon wax. I held her tight, blinking back tears that burned hotter than any I'd cried before. This wasn't just betrayal between adults. They were rewriting Lily's world, pushing me into the margins like a character cut from her own family portrait. When Daniel returned, Lily was napping on the couch, the drawing tucked under my arm like contraband. I wanted to confront him right then, to demand answers. But one look at his tired face stopped me. He was weighed down enough juggling long hours at the bank, oblivious to the storm brewing in his own house. If I told him now, he might dismiss it as my imagination. I couldn't risk that. Instead, I kissed Lily's forehead, whispered goodbye, and drove home with the drawing lying face up on the passenger seat. Every stoplight I hit, my eyes returned to it, to the crude blue lines of tears sliding down my stick figure face. At my kitchen table that night, I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat, added it to the growing folder of evidence. Bank statements, photographs, text messages, and now the testimony of a 6-year-old in crayon. Proof that Ava's betrayal wasn't just aimed at me. It was poisoning the very heart of my family. And I knew then I could no longer just collect evidence. I had to start planning my counterattack. On Monday morning, I drove into town with a knot in my stomach and a clear destination in mind. The little electronics shop on Main Street was quiet, the bell above the door chiming as I stepped inside. Rows of gadgets gleamed under fluorescent lights, headphones, chargers, cheap phones. I asked the clerk, a boy barely older than some of my former students, if they carried voice recorders. He pointed to a glass case near the counter. I chose a small digital one that could fit in the palm of my hand, sleek black with a single red button. Perfect for recording lessons, I lied smoothly when he asked what it was for. My voice didn't waver. Decades of teaching had taught me how to mask nerves. I left with the recorder nestled in my purse, feeling like I'd just purchased a weapon. That afternoon, I called Ava. Would it be a bad time to stop by? I made arroz con leche, and I thought Lily might like some. She hesitated before answering, her tone carefully, even. Of course, suegra. Come by. I slipped the recorder into the inner pocket of my cardigan before heading over. My heart beat loud enough, I worried she might hear it when she opened the door. Lily came running first, squealing at the sight of the dessert container. Ava followed, smiling, with that polished courtesy she had perfected, the kind that felt like a blade hidden behind silk. We sat in the living room, the scent of cinnamon filling the air as Lily disappeared into her room with a bowl. I positioned myself on the sofa cardigan, folded neatly in my lap, the recorder already humming silently. After a few minutes of idle chatter, I leaned forward, lowering my voice as though confiding a secret. Ava, can I ask your advice? I have a friend, she's about my age, going through a divorce. Her husband is trying to take a house she owned before marriage. She's terrified she'll lose it. Ava's eyes sharpened. Curiosity piqued. She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse and gave a little shrug that was far too self-satisfied. Well, it's not as simple as who bought what. Even if a house is technically separate property, if the spouse can show that community funds were used for improvements, remodels, upgrades, even long-term maintenance, they can argue for a share. Sometimes even half. I nodded slowly, as though hearing this for the first time. But if the deed is in her name alone, Ava smirked, leaning back against the sofa. Deeds matter, but judges care about contribution. If her husband painted a wall, fixed a roof, or if their joint money paid for a new kitchen, suddenly it's community property. I've seen plenty of cases like that. Her tone wasn't neutral. It carried the confidence of someone who had already rehearsed the argument in her head. And if there are savings, I pressed gently. Accounts in both names. That's the easiest of all. Community property by default, Ava replied. She didn't even blink. The smart play is to move money gradually in small amounts into an account under a different name. Harder to trace, especially if the person isn't looking. Her words sliced through me, confirmation of everything I feared. My fingers curled against the fabric of my cardigan, fighting the urge to shake. That's very thorough, I murmured, forcing my lips into a faint smile. Ava preened under the attention as though she were giving a guest lecture. Well, I am an attorney. These things come with the territory. We chatted a little longer, circling safer topics, Lily's school projects, Daniel's long hours. But my mind was already far from the conversation, fixed on the tiny device humming away in my lap. When I finally left, Ava hugged me at the door, the picture of a dutiful daughter-in-law. I carried the arroz con leche container back empty. But what I had truly taken was far more valuable. Back in my car, I slipped the recorder from my pocket, pressed stop, and watched the little screen confirm 1 hour 12 minutes, 37 seconds. Every word preserved. And as I placed it carefully into my purse, I felt the first flicker of power returning to me. The quiet knowledge that Ava had just handed me the first nail for her own coffin. 2 days later, I sat across from Miles Harrington, a family attorney recommended by Nora's friend. His office smelled of leather and old books lined with framed certificates and shelves weighed down by case files. He was in his early 50s, sharp-eyed, but approachable, the kind of man who had seen enough betrayals to recognize one before the client finished telling it. I laid the manila folder on his desk and slid it forward. "This is everything I've gathered so far." He opened it, scanning the statements, the withdrawals, the transfers in Ava's maiden name. His brows lifted slightly when he reached the transcript of my recorder's contents. "Smart," he murmured. "You documented before they made the first official move." I folded my hands in my lap, forcing them to stay still. I was a teacher. Evidence always came before action. Miles leaned back in his chair. "Let's start with the house. You inherited it before marriage, correct?" "Yes. My mother left it to me. It's been in my name alone since the deed was signed." "Then that property is yours," he said firmly. "Separate property by law. They can wave around arguments about improvements, but with documentation of inheritance, no judge will award them ownership. At worst, they could try for reimbursement claims, but nothing that strips you of the title." The tension in my chest loosened slightly. For weeks, I had imagined Richard and Ava walking through my front door with papers declaring my home no longer mine. Now, a measure of certainty steadied me. Miles tapped the bank statements. "The bigger issue is the money. The withdrawals are suspicious, and the transfers to Ava's account are a clear breach of trust. What we need to do is cut off the flow before they drain more. That means freezing the joint accounts." My pulse jumped. "Can I do that without his consent?" "Yes," Miles said. "You file for a temporary freeze citing suspected misuse. The bank complies until both parties appear in front of a judge. It buys you time and locks them out." I nodded, the teacher in me already turning his words into a checklist. "And while the accounts are frozen, you continue gathering," he said. "Every receipt, every statement, every text. We'll build a timeline of misrepresentation. The stronger your documentation, the stronger your counterattack." Counterattack. The word hummed in my ears. I wasn't merely defending myself anymore. I was preparing to strike back. Miles leaned forward, his voice quiet, but edged with steel. "They underestimated you, Mrs. Moreno. That's their mistake. With this evidence, you have the advantage. Use it." For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe deeply. Not because the storm had passed, it hadn't, but because I finally held an umbrella in my hands. When I left his office folder clutched to my chest once more, I felt different. Lighter, sharper, no longer cornered. The victim had begun to fade. The strategist was taking shape. That night, as I spread the papers across my kitchen table, I knew the next move would be mine. Miles met me at the bank on a gray Thursday morning. The marble floor echoed under our shoes as we walked to the manager's office, my folder pressed tight against my ribs. Don Lewis, the branch manager who had known Richard and me for decades, looked uncomfortable when we sat down. His balding head shone under the fluorescent light as he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Moreno, I received your request," he began. "It's unusual, but within your rights. Freezing the joint accounts will require signatures and proper documentation." Miles slid the prepared forms across the desk with professional precision. "Everything's here. We're requesting a temporary freeze due to suspicious withdrawals and transfers. Standard protection measure." Don read the forms, slowly, eyes flicking between me and Miles. He knew my family knew Richard. For a moment, I thought he might refuse out of loyalty. But then he stamped the papers, clicked his pen, and nodded. "Effective immediately. Both account holders will need to appear before a judge for any future changes." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The accounts were locked, our savings secure. Richard and Ava's siphoning cut off. By the time I walked back to my car, My knees trembled, but my heart felt steadier. I had built a wall where before there was only open field. That evening, the storm broke. Richard slammed the front door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I was setting the table with leftover stew when he strode into the kitchen. His face flushed, fists clenched. "What the hell did you do at the bank, Marga?" His voice was loud enough to shake the windows. I turned slowly, spoon still in hand, forcing calm into my posture. "At the bank." "Don't play dumb," he barked. "They told me our accounts are frozen." I couldn't withdraw a cent. I've been sitting there like an idiot while the manager gave me some line about suspicious activity. I stirred the pot deliberately, letting the silence stretch. That's strange. Maybe it's a computer problem. Richard's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Don't you start. Did you file something? Have you lost your mind? You're paranoid. Isabel." Confused, acting like some bitter old woman seeing shadows where there aren't any. His words hit with the same cruelty as Ava's smirk, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. Confused. "Richard, I've been balancing this household for 35 years. I know where every dollar goes. If something happened with the accounts, it must be for a reason." He stepped closer. The anger in his eyes edged with something else, fear. "Undo it. Tomorrow. Go back to that bank and fix this or you'll regret it." I kept my voice, even almost puzzled. "Regret it. For protecting our savings." Richard turned away, pacing the length of the kitchen like a trapped animal. "You're impossible," he muttered. "Talking nonsense. People are starting to think you're unstable." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Let him believe I was confused. Let him underestimate me. The more he dismissed me, the sharper my advantage became. I set his bowl on the table. "Eat before it gets cold." He glared, but sat shoving a spoonful into his mouth as though chewing could silence the fury boiling inside him. I watched him without blinking, thinking of Miles's words. "They underestimated you. Use it." And as Richard grumbled about paranoia and confusion, I quietly resolved to keep the mask on as long as I had to. Because behind it, the trap was tightening one quiet click at a time. The next step would require more than patience, it would demand precision. I called Ava the next morning. My voice softened with a tremor. I didn't have to practice too hard. "Ava dear, could you spare a little time today? I made fresh coffee cake and I get so muddled with these bank things. Maybe you can help me understand?" She hesitated, but the lure of being the clever one was too strong. "Of course, Suegra. I'll come by after lunch." When she arrived, she carried herself with that lawyer's confidence heels clicking hair pinned smooth, a faint smile like she was walking into court, already certain of victory. I played the part of the tired grandmother cardigan sagging shoulders, slumped my hands wringing at the hem. "Sit, sit," I urged, setting coffee and cake on the table. "I've been so confused since yesterday. The bank called something about our accounts. I thought maybe you'd understand better than me." Her eyes flickered with interest. "What did they say exactly?" I sighed, fumbling through my purse, as if searching for the right note. In truth, the slip of paper with the manager's number had been ready since morning. I slid it across the table with a shaky hand. This man, Don Lewis, said to call if I had questions. "Would you? I just can't make heads or tails of it." Ava's lips curved faintly, almost indulgent. She dialed, pressing the button for speakerphone. "This is Ava calling with my mother-in-law, Isabel. We'd like clarification on her account status." Don's voice came through steady. "Yes, ma'am. As I explained yesterday, the joint accounts were placed under temporary freeze due to irregular withdrawals." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Irregular withdrawals. Ava's posture stiffened. Her eyes flicked to me, searching my expression. I kept mine deliberately foggy brows knitted, as if lost in a foreign language. Irregular withdrawals, I echoed softly, twisting my napkin. What does that mean? Don replied. Multiple small amounts transferred out consistently over the last several months. For security, both account holders must be present before any more activity is permitted. Ava swallowed the sound loud in the sudden quiet. Her hand trembled just slightly as she ended the call. I tilted my head, voice lined with worry. Do you think Richard's been careless? He always says I imagine things. But irregular? That sounds serious, doesn't it? She forced a thin smile, but the color had drained from her cheeks. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing suegra. Sometimes banks are overly cautious. It doesn't mean anything criminal. I leaned forward, lowering my voice as though sharing a fragile secret. But what if it does? What if someone's been moving money without me knowing? Her mask slipped for a second, the barest flash of panic in her eyes. She sipped her coffee too quickly, burning her tongue, muttering a curse under her breath. I sat back, letting silence fill the space. In that pause, I savored the shift. For weeks, she had held the upper hand, smirking behind my son's back, whispering into my husband's ear. But now, at my table, with the word irregular echoing like a bell, she was the one scrambling for footing. Ava pushed her chair back abruptly. I really should be going. Thank you for the cake, it was delicious. Her voice was tight, brittle. I smiled sweetly, patting her arm with all the warmth of a grandmother. Of course, dear. You've always been such a help. When the door shut behind her, I allowed my shoulders to straighten, the foggy mask sliding away. The old woman she thought predictable had just shown her teeth. That night, I opened my folder and tucked the slip of paper inside, right next to the recording of her own words about separate property. The pieces were lining up, and for the first time, I felt the balance tip in my favor. And I knew it was time to move to the next step, bringing Daniel into the light. I invited Daniel over on Sunday under the guise of a family dinner. I cooked his favorite roast chicken with rosemary and set the table with the good dishes. If he noticed the effort, he didn't say. He looked worn. His tie loosened the tiredness of a man carrying too much. Over the meal, I let the conversation flow easily at first. Work Lily's latest obsession with dinosaurs, the weather. Only after his plate was cleared did I push my cup of tea aside and fold my hands. Daniel, I said gently, there's something I need to talk to you about, and I need you to listen before you react. His brow furrowed. Mom, you're scaring me. What is it? I drew a steadying breath. I've noticed money leaving the joint accounts. Small withdrawals, nearly $10,000 over a few months. They're not routine expenses. They're going somewhere else. He blinked, clearly caught off guard. That doesn't sound right. Dad handles most of that stuff. Maybe it's for the shop. It isn't, I said firmly. I checked. And there are transfers to an account under Ava's maiden name. The silence was immediate, thick as molasses. He shook his head slowly. No, that can't be. Ava wouldn't. She'd never do that without telling me. I reached across the table, laying my hand over his. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you need to see the inconsistencies. Your father tells me he's at the shop, but I've seen him at Ava's house. They're together when you're not there. Daniel yanked his hand back, his face reddening. Mom, stop. This sounds like paranoia. You've always been protective, but Ava isn't like that. She's my wife. His defense was automatic, but there was a flicker, just a flicker in his eyes. Doubt. I wish it weren't true, I whispered. Do you think I want to believe the woman I welcomed as a daughter is plotting with your father? That I want to think they're taking from our family? But Daniel, the numbers don't lie, and neither do their own words. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Words. What words? I hesitated, choosing carefully. Ava explained to me how separate property can be turned into community property. She laid it out like a roadmap. She thought I was asking for a friend. Daniel's jaw tightened. Maybe she was just speaking generally as a lawyer. That doesn't prove anything. No, it doesn't, I admitted softly. But added to the money, the withdrawals, the lies, it paints a picture. One you can't afford to ignore. He stood suddenly, pushing his chair back. I can't listen to this. I won't let you turn me against my wife. Not without proof. I swallowed the sting of his words. I understand. But remember what I said, when you were a boy, sometimes the truth hides in the smallest cracks. Watch closely, Daniel. You'll see. He didn't answer. He grabbed his jacket and left, but not before I caught that shadow of uncertainty lingering in his eyes. When the door closed, I gathered the dishes with trembling hands, knowing the seed of doubt had been planted. And seeds once planted, always grow. I knew Daniel wasn't ready to believe me. His love for Ava was a shield, one I couldn't shatter with numbers or theories. But time and patience, those were weapons sharper than anger. I needed their own voices, words they could never deny. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening. Ava called, her tone bright but brittle. Suegra, I'm stopping by tomorrow with some paperwork from the PTA. Thought I'd drop it off and have a quick chat. My pulse quickened. She never stopped by without a reason. And paperwork for the PTA. That was a pretext if I'd ever heard one. I slipped the recorder into the hollow of my cardigan pocket and prepared the house as if I were simply an aging grandmother tidying up. When she arrived, she placed a thin folder on the coffee table and sank into the armchair, crossing her legs neatly. Daniel's working late again. She sighed more to herself than to me. The man's practically married to his bank. I offered coffee, but she waved it off. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up without hesitation. I busied myself in the kitchen doorway, eyes down, but ears sharp. Her voice dropped into that silky cadence she used when she thought no one was paying attention. Yes, once the petition is filed, she'll fold. Isabel's predictable, always has been. She won't want the embarrassment. My stomach lurched. Petition, fold, embarrassment. She wasn't speaking about some distant client. She was speaking about me. I kept my breathing steady, hand grazing the recorder button through my cardigan to ensure it was capturing every word. She continued, Richard, trust me. Judges love the clean narrative old woman long marriage husband just wants fairness. It writes itself. She'll sign. I froze in place, my blood cold. She was speaking to Richard, my husband, the father of my son. Ava laughed, then low and confident. Once the judge signs, we'll be done. No fuss, no dragging. She'll have no choice. My knees weakened, but I gripped the counter, keeping silent until she ended the call. When she turned back to me, her face was the mask of charm again, the dutiful daughter-in-law bringing school forms. Sorry about that, she said sweetly. Just a client. I forced a shaky smile. Of course, dear. You're always so busy. Inside, though, the mask had slipped for her. I had every syllable stored now, words they could never take back. After she left, I sat at the table, the folder untouched, staring at the recorder's blinking light. My hands trembled as I played it back. Her voice filled the kitchen, confident, calculating, dismissing me as though I were already erased from my own life. Once the petition is filed, she'll fold. I pressed, stop my eyes burning. 35 years of marriage boiled down to a strategy session between my husband and the woman who had married my son. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text. I picked it up, heart pounding. It wasn't for me, it was from Richard, sent mistakenly to my number. The message read, Judge signed. Call me. The spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the tile floor. There it was. Confirmation beyond any doubt. Richard wasn't just drifting into Ava's orbit. He was fully tethered to her, conspiring in the open, so sure I'd never see the threads. I saved the message instantly, forwarding it to my email like the others. Proof upon proof, each piece falling into place. The charade wasn't just cracked, it was shattered. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair with the recorder on the table and Richard's text glowing on my phone screen. My chest ached. But beneath the ache was something stronger: resolve. If they thought the old woman would fold, they had forgotten the first rule every student learns in my classroom. The test isn't over until the teacher says so, and I was just getting ready to grade. I set the table that Sunday, as if nothing in the world had shifted, though everything had. The china my mother left me gleamed under the dining room light, the roast chicken filled the air with rosemary, and the flan chilled in the refrigerator waiting for dessert. It looked like every other family dinner we'd shared over the years. Only I knew it wasn't. Richard arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine he hadn't bothered to wrap. He kissed my cheek too quickly, his lips dry, his eyes avoiding mine. "Smells great," he muttered, placing the bottle down as though his duty was complete. Ava and Daniel came together, Lily bounding through the door ahead of them. She hugged me tight, her small arms the only warmth that felt real in that moment. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in her innocence like a balm against the storm raging inside me. Dinner began with chatter about Daniel's long week at the bank, Lily's science project, Ava's new case. I listened, nodding, spooning potatoes onto plates, smiling where expected. I played my role with the patience of a seasoned actress. But the folder in my study weighed heavier than any prop recording statements the text Richard had sent by mistake. Proof of what they thought was hidden. Halfway through the meal, I lifted my glass. "A toast," I said, my voice calm, steady. Everyone paused, glasses raised out of reflex. Richard shifted. Ava's fork hovered above her plate. Daniel smiled, oblivious. "To honesty," I said simply, "the glue that holds families together." The words hung in the air like frost. Richard's smile faltered, his knuckles whitening around the stem of his glass. Ava lowered hers slowly, her eyes darting to Richard before she forced a laugh. "That's a good one, Suegra. Honesty is important." Daniel chuckled lightly, sipping his wine without noticing how stiff the room had become. "Hear, hear." But I saw it. The glances passed like contraband. Richard to Ava, Ava, back to Richard. The silent calculation flickering in their eyes. I didn't press further. Not yet. I only sipped, holding the silence long enough for their unease to thicken. Ava fidgeted with her napkin, her usual composure slipping. "So Lily," she said too brightly, "tell Grandma about the play at school." Richard latched onto the distraction like a drowning man to a rope. "Yes, the play Daniel didn't? You say she has a big part?" I smiled at Lily, encouraging her to speak. She launched into a story about rehearsals, her small voice rising above the undercurrent at the table. I let her fill the space, my own silence deliberate. As plates emptied, the tension grew unbearable. Richard kept refilling his glass, though he hardly drank. Ava avoided eye contact, her shoulders too rigid for someone in her own son's home. Daniel looked between us, confused, as though catching only the faintest scent of smoke, while the fire smoldered unseen. I didn't need to say more. My toast had done the work. I had planted the word honesty in their midst, and it would rattle in their heads long after dessert. When the flan was finally served, I watched Ava push it around her plate without eating. Richard checked his watch twice. Daniel tried to lighten the mood, asking about my garden, but his voice was strained. I waited calm, composed, feeding Lily another spoonful when she asked for seconds. I would not give them the satisfaction of a crack. They wanted me to fold. Instead, I raised my glass and reminded them I was watching. After they left, the house was quiet again, only the clink of dishes as I loaded the sink. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was fixed on the truth their act couldn't last much longer, and I was ready for the moment it finally shattered. Miles arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. His leather briefcase darkened at the corners, where drops of water had soaked in. He shook my hand firmly before stepping into my living room, his presence steadying me. The storm outside felt like a fitting echo of what was about to unfold inside. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked, setting his case down by the coffee table. "I've been ready for weeks," I replied, though my voice came softer than I intended. We sat together. The evidence spread out like a syllabus on the table. Highlighted bank statements with the suspicious withdrawals. Photocopies of the deed proving my house was inherited before marriage. Richard's errant text message. Lily's heartbreaking drawing. And finally, the recorder, with its blinking red light ready to play. Every item told a piece of the story they had tried to bury. Richard and Ava arrived within minutes of each other, their expressions rehearsed into neutrality. Richard carried that worn mechanic's jacket like a uniform of humility. Ava's blazer was sharp enough to cut. Daniel came too, holding Lily by the hand, though he quickly ushered her into the den with a coloring book so she wouldn't see what was about to happen. I stood tall. "Sit," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "We need to clear the air." Richard smirked as if humoring a child. "What now, Marga? Another toast to honesty?" I didn't flinch. "Exactly that." Miles introduced himself with professional formality. "I represent Mrs. Moreno in matters concerning property and financial irregularities. We've reviewed extensive documentation. I suggest you listen carefully." The shift was instant. Richard's smirk wavered. Ava's hand twitched on the armrest nails, tapping a nervous rhythm. I laid the bank statements down first, each page covered in Nora's careful circles. Nearly $10,000 siphoned from our joint accounts. Small withdrawals timed perfectly to slip under the radar, and transfers straight into an account under Ava's maiden name. Richard opened his mouth, but Miles cut him off smoothly. "We've already confirmed the routing. A subpoena will tie it directly to you, Mrs. Hale. That's criminal exposure." Ava's face blanched, though she tried to mask it with a shrug. "Maybe it's a mistake. A clerical error." I pressed play on the recorder. Ava's own voice filled the room, confident and mocking. "Once the petition is filed, she'll fold. Isabel's predictable. Always has been." The words hit harder than any shout. Daniel's head jerked toward his wife, his eyes wide with shock. Richard leaned forward, his face draining of color. I let the silence weigh a moment before pressing play again. If her husband painted a wall, fixed a roof, or if their joint money paid for a new kitchen, suddenly it's community property. Miles leaned in, voice cold. "These statements alone are grounds for a bar complaint. You used privileged family information to conspire against your own client by extension. The state board won't take that lightly." Ava's facade cracked. I was speaking hypothetically. It was just a conversation. But then I laid Lily's drawing on the table, the stick figures like a knife through the pretense. Mommy, Daddy, Lily, and Grandma. Crying alone in the corner. Daniel's eyes filled, his hand shaking as he picked up the page. "You told her I was moving with Dad. You told her Grandma doesn't belong." Ava's mouth opened and closed. No polished defense came. Richard finally found his voice lashing out. "This is absurd. She's twisting things. You know your mother. She's dramatic, always imagining I slid my phone across the table." The screen lit with his text. Judge signed, "Call me." His breath caught audibly. Daniel stared at the words, his jaw tightening. Miles folded his hands. "Here are the facts. You've conspired to strip Mrs. Moreno of her assets, misrepresented legal advice, and attempted to manipulate her family against her. We're filing for protective orders on the accounts, and a bar complaint will be lodged against you, Ava, unless you withdraw from any petition and acknowledge Mrs. Moreno's sole property rights." The room broke into fragments of noise, Richard cursing under his breath, Ava stammering, Daniel whispering no over and over like a prayer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You wanted me to fold. You counted on my silence. But silence doesn't mean weakness. I taught for 40 years, and if there's one lesson I know, it's this: actions have consequences. Ava crumpled, then her confidence gone, tears streaking her face. Richard looked at her with disgust, realizing she'd cracked under the very pressure they thought I couldn't withstand. Daniel set the drawing down gently and looked at me. For the first time, his eyes held no denial, only grief. I closed the folder with deliberate care. The evidence was sealed, undeniable, ready for the next step. And as the storm outside battered the windows, I knew the true storm had only just begun, because cornered people don't always surrender. Sometimes they fight back. Richard's fist slammed against the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. "This is insane," he shouted, his face red, veins straining at his neck. "She's losing her mind, can't you all see that? 35 years, and now she invents stories because she's lonely." I didn't flinch. I'd weathered louder storms in classrooms, filled with unruly teenagers, and I knew when noise was only a mask for fear. Daniel shifted in his chair, torn between the father he had always looked up to and the mother whose calm defiance now filled the room. "Dad?" He began, his voice low, uncertain. Richard turned on him. "Don't you dare, Daniel. Don't you dare take her side in this madness. She's confused. Old age does that." My son's eyes flicked toward me, and I saw the hesitation, the child who wanted to believe in his father, still wrestling inside the man who knew better. That hesitation cut deeper than Richard's shouting. I reached for the recorder, pressed the button, and let the room fill with Ava's voice. "She doesn't suspect anything." The sound seemed to vacuum the air from the space. No one moved. Even Richard's fury faltered as his gaze darted to Ava, whose eyes closed as though she'd been slapped. Daniel's shoulders dropped. The fight in him melted into something heavier realization. He stared at his wife, then at his father, then finally at me. "She wasn't lying," he whispered. Richard tried again, weaker this time. It's out of context. You don't know what she meant." But the silence that followed killed every excuse. Ava's tear-streaked face was answer enough. I folded my hands neatly on the table, my voice calm. "There will be no more shouting, no more lies. Here are the terms. Richard, you keep the shop. You keep your truck. But the house, my house, remains mine, as it always has. The savings accounts stay with me. You sign, and you leave, quietly. No courtroom spectacle, no shame for Daniel or Lily. If you refuse, every piece of evidence goes before a judge." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. The rage was still there, but beneath it lay panic, the kind of fear only a man cornered by his own deeds could feel. "You'd destroy your own family over this," he spat finally. I looked at him steadily. "You destroyed it the moment you decided to build another one with her." Daniel dropped his face into his hands, breathing hard, as if the weight of both parents' failures pressed down at once. Ava said nothing, only stared at the floor, her hands twisting the edge of her blazer like a child caught cheating. Richard pushed back his chair and stood pacing toward the doorway, as though distance might loosen the noose. "You can't just erase me, Isabel. I built this life too. You built the shop," I said firmly. "You built your reputation in town, and I don't intend to take that from you. But the house was never yours. The savings came from my years of work, tutoring, scraping, planning. You tried to take what wasn't yours. Now I'm giving you the only exit you'll get with dignity." Miles slid the separation papers across the table, his pen poised. These terms are fair. More than fair, considering what we have documented. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, chest heaving, torn between defiance and defeat. His eyes burned into mine, but I didn't waver. The years of meals cooked, shirts ironed, and loyalty given without question lined up behind me like silent witnesses. At last his shoulders sagged. He came back, took the pen, and scribbled his name with a violence that nearly tore the page. He shoved the papers back, muttering, "Keep your damn house. Keep your money. See if they keep you warm at night." I gathered the signed papers, sliding them into the folder. My voice was steady, even gentle. "Warmth doesn't come from lies, Richard. It comes from truth. And I've finally reclaimed mine." He stalked out without another word, the screen door banging shut behind him. The echo lingered in the quiet house, the sound of deceit leaving for good. Daniel sat silent, tears clinging to the corners of his eyes. Ava reached for his arm, but he pulled away, rising slowly. "I need air," he muttered, walking toward the porch. I stayed behind the papers in my hands, the storm outside finally beginning to clear. The battle was not finished, but the first true victory had been claimed. And I knew the reckoning with Ava was yet to come. The days after Richard's signature felt like the slow settling of a house after a quake. Nothing looked broken from the outside, but inside the foundations had shifted forever. Ava came to the house the next evening, her face pale, her blazer rumpled as if she hadn't slept. Daniel followed, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same place where the lies had unraveled. "I have to tell you," Ava began, her voice hoarse. She glanced at me, then at Daniel, who sat stiffly, arms crossed. "I was part of it. I moved money. I planned to argue for the house. I let Richard believe that we could win." Her words trembled, but they came out all the same. Daniel didn't move. His silence weighed heavier than any outburst. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the tears spilling now. "I thought I was protecting us, protecting Lily's future. But I was greedy. I betrayed you." Daniel stood slowly, pushing back his chair. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "You betrayed more than me. You betrayed our daughter." He looked at me, then his eyes glassy. "I can't keep Lily in that house. Not now." Ava broke, then sobbing into her hands. I felt no triumph, only the hollow echo of what betrayal leaves behind. The following morning, Richard arrived with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't meet my eyes as he set it by the door. His once proud stance sagged. The fight drained from him. "The shop's yours to keep," I said quietly, though we both knew he had signed away the house and the savings. He nodded, once muttered something that might have been goodbye, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. Later that day, Miles called. "It's official," he said. "The bar has suspended Ava pending investigation. She won't be practicing law anytime soon." His tone was professional, but I could hear the weight of it. When I hung up, I found Daniel in the living room. Lily curled asleep on his lap. He brushed a hand through her hair, his face caught between heartbreak and relief. "She asked me to forgive her," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can. All I know is Lily deserves better than shadows and lies." I touched his shoulder gently. "You both do." That night, Lily stayed in the guest room, her small snores drifting down the hallway. Daniel lay awake on the couch, and I sat in my chair, the folder of evidence tucked away at last. The storm had broken the pieces scattered, and all that remained was the question of what could be rebuilt from the wreckage. And as dawn bled into the sky, I knew the end wasn't just theirs. It was mine, too. The next step would be learning how to live in the silence they had left behind. The house felt different once Richard's footsteps no longer echoed through the halls. Quieter, yes, but not empty. The quiet was mine now, not the silence of being ignored, but the calm of space reclaimed. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, once a place of hurried overnight visits and stacked boxes. The bedding was folded away, the furniture rearranged. I carried in shelves a chalkboard and bins of supplies. Piece by piece, it became my new tutoring studio. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and fresh paint, a reminder that I was building something again. The first students arrived timidly, children from the neighborhood who needed extra help after school. I saw in their eyes the same hunger I'd recognized in my classrooms for decades. I set out workbooks, sharpened pencils, and filled the space with encouragement. Their laughter seeped into the walls, chasing away what lingered of betrayal. Daniel, true to his word, requested a transfer to a branch closer to my town. He wanted stability, for Lily wanted her to feel rooted in a home that wouldn't vanish beneath her feet. Some nights he stayed on the couch, too tired to drive back. I never minded. The house had room for healing. Lily filled the kitchen with her presence each afternoon. Together we baked cookies, empanadas, cinnamon rolls, her flour-dusted cheeks glowing with pride as she announced to Daniel, "Grandma, let me crack the eggs all by myself." Those afternoons reminded me that some bonds don't weaken under pressure. They harden into steel. Ava moved 2 cities away. I heard from Daniel that she took a small apartment near her sister. Suspended from practice, her name whispered with disapproval at her firm. I didn't celebrate her downfall, though. It felt less like a victory and more like a necessary clearing of fire that left behind only what could grow again. In the evenings when the tutoring papers were stacked neatly and Lily was asleep, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea. The house hummed with its new rhythm. No shouting, no secrets, only the steady breathing of peace. One night, Daniel lingered in the doorway, watching me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know how you stayed so strong." I smiled, setting down my cup. "Because I had to. For myself. For you. For Lily." He nodded, his eyes softening. "You've given us more than a house. You've given us a chance to start over." I looked around the room, the same walls, the same roof, but everything had changed. Not because I surrendered, but because I refused to. And in that refusal, I had found freedom. But even as the peace grew louder, I wondered what came next, what life would ask of me now that I finally stood on steady ground. 6 months passed and the seasons shifted. Winter's bite gave way to spring, then summer bloomed and faded into the crisp air of autumn. My house, once a battlefield of whispers and schemes, had become a sanctuary. Lily's drawings now lined the refrigerator door bright with color. One in particular always caught my eye. Grandma in the center, Lily by my side, Daniel smiling nearby. No tears streaked my figure this time. Instead, I stood tall, a sun drawn above me, rays stretching outward. Children often see truths more clearly than adults, and her picture told me we had found our balance again. The tutoring sessions grew. What began with a handful of children expanded into teens gathered around my kitchen table. Some came for math, some for writing, but all left with more than lessons. I spoke to them about resilience, about standing tall when life demanded they kneel. They listened wide-eyed as I told them, "Dignity is the one inheritance no one can steal." Every time I said it, I felt the words deepen in me too. Daniel kept his promise, working nearby, building a steadier life for Lily. He still carried wounds. Betrayal is never clean, but he no longer lived in denial. When he visited, he often lingered at the table, watching his daughter laugh with me, relief etched into his face. As for Richard, I heard little. A mechanic's jacket glimpsed at the edge of town now, and then a figure weighed down by choices he couldn't undo. Ava remained a shadow in another city. Their absence was its own kind of peace. In the quiet of evening, when papers were stacked and the kitchen smelled faintly of chalk and cinnamon, I often sat with tea and thought of the past. They mistook age for weakness. I mistook love for safety. Both were illusions. Only truth held. Truth had burned away the lies, left the frost cracked and melting, and in its place something unexpected grew, not bitterness, but dignity, reclaimed. I closed my eyes, hearing Lily's laughter echo down the hall. For the first time in years, the sound carried no shadows. It was pure, and it was mine. The house was no longer just walls and rooms. It was proof that even after betrayal, life could root itself again in stronger soil. And as autumn's wind rattled the windows, I knew this was not an ending. It was the season after the frost, the one where life begins anew.